The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless song above Oak Creek Memorial's ICU, the same frequency Elena Martinez had learned to ignore 18 months ago. She moved through the sterile corridors at 11:24 p.m., restocking for supplies with the kind of methodical precision that made her invisible. Perfect. Invisibility was survival. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, unmarked except for the name badge that read E. Martinez, RN. Not Major. Not Lionheart 6. Just a nurse who kept her head down and never made waves. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee and something underneath, the copper iron scent of blood that most people learn to stop noticing. Elena never stopped noticing. Noticing kept you alive. She straightened a row of 14-gauge angiocath needles in the crash cart, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who had organized medical supplies in far worse conditions. Canvas tents. Mortar fire. The smell of diesel fuel and something burning. She didn't let those memories surface. Not here. Not now. The right shoulder beneath her scrubs, the one mapped with surgical scars from shrapnel that should have ended her, stiffened as she reached for the upper shelf. She switched hands. Adapted. Moved on. The ICU was quieter on night shift. Fewer attending physicians. Fewer residents asking questions. Fewer people who noticed anything at all. Elena preferred it that way. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, punctuated by the steady beep-beep-beep of cardiac monitors. Room for 41, post-op coronary artery bypass. Room for 43, pneumonia, responding to antibiotics. Room for 45, routine admission, stable overnight. She knew the status of every patient in this unit without reading charts because she had trained herself to listen for the language of machines. A heart monitor that skipped. A ventilator that changed pitch. Oxygen saturation climbing or falling. These were the voices that mattered. At 11:52 p.m., the overhead intercom crackled. Emergency department, incoming. Trauma alert. ETA for minutes. Elena's hand stilled. For minutes meant serious. For minutes meant this wasn't routine. She moved without being asked, her body responding before her mind caught up. She was already pulling fresh equipment when the nursing supervisor appeared. High-priority patient, the supervisor said, breathless. VIP admission. General Marcus Hale, Green Beret commander. Cardiac event in his home. Retrieved by his security team. Stable now, but they want full monitoring post-op. Caldwell's taking the case personally. The name hit Elena like a defibrillator shock to the chest. Except she didn't flinch. Didn't freeze. Didn't let her face change at all. She simply continued organizing the supplies in front of her, oxygen tubing, cardiac leads, the crash cart ready. Her fingers found the dog tag beneath her scrubs without her consciously reaching for it, a broken chain with one name engraved in military block letters. She touched it once. Let her hand drop. Which room? Elena asked. Her voice was steady. Level. Professional. For 47, they're prepping him now. Caldwell wants the best ICU nurses. You're on the case. Elena nodded. Said nothing. The supervisor left. The ICU hummed on around her, alarms soft and distant like a lullaby designed by machines. She had trained herself not to react to things that could kill her. This was the same skill, applied differently. At 11:56 p.m., the stretcher rolled through the ICU doors like an incoming medevac. Elena watched from the nurse's station, pretending to organize the medication dispensary. She kept her body angled away. Kept her face neutral. Kept her hands occupied with busy work that meant nothing. The general on the stretcher was unconscious, post-sedation, tubes running from his nose and arm. His face was older than she remembered from 3 years ago, deeper lines, grayer at the temples, the kind of aging that came from command and loss. She recognized his jawline, the square set of his shoulders, the scar along his left ear that he'd gotten during the 2009 deployment. The way his hands lay at his sides, even unconscious, with the kind of disciplined calm that came from 28 years in the Green Berets. She knew those hands. They had held her son's hand during transport, while mortar rounds were still incoming, while she was 3 operating tables away, stitching shrapnel wounds on a 19-year-old private from North Carolina, unable to leave her post, unable to go to him, unable to do anything but work because that was the job. That was the discipline. That was what it meant to be an officer. Dr. Caldwell swept in behind the stretcher, his presence moving the air. He was tall, expensive, the kind of man who wore cologne in a hospital, something imported, something that cost money. His voice was smooth as oil and just as slick when he spoke to the residents trailing behind him. General Hale is a guest of this hospital and a personal acquaintance. His care is our highest priority. Room for 47, cardiac monitoring, post-operative protocol. I'll be handling the case personally. He didn't look at the nursing staff. They were furniture. Get the best we have. Elena pulled the chart for room for 47 without being asked. She was already moving, already reading. The admitting notes were sparse. Cardiac event at 22:15, EKG showed changes, troponin elevated at 2.4, stabilized with nitroglycerine. Calcium channel blocker administered by his field medic. Current sedation, propofol at 50 micrograms per kilogram per minute with midazolam for anxiolysis. She stopped at the medication line and read it again. The dosing was aggressive. Too aggressive for a stable cardiac patient. Propofol at that rate, combined with midazolam, would suppress respiratory drive past the point of safety. Most post-op patients needed sedation, but this protocol was more appropriate for a trauma intubation, not for someone who was breathing on his own, whose heart rate was already dropping toward hypertension. Elena pulled the lab values, blood pressure 118/74. Heart rate 58. Oxygen saturation 99% on 3 liters supplemental. The patient was stable. He didn't need deep sedation. He needed monitoring, not chemical restraint. She approached the nursing station where Dr. Caldwell was reviewing orders on the computer. 3 residents stood nearby, watching. Taking notes. Learning how to be like him, the important kind of doctor, the kind hospitals fought over, the kind who got named chief of surgery because he maintained donor relationships and kept mortality statistics low. Dr. Caldwell. Elena's voice was quiet. Professional. The voice of someone who worked here and understood the hierarchy. I have a question about the post-op sedation protocol for General Hale. Caldwell's fingers stilled on the keyboard. He didn't turn around for a full 2 seconds. When he did, his eyes moved across her name badge like he was cataloging an obstacle. You have a question. He said it the way someone might say a machine had developed a rattle. The propofol dosing at 50 micrograms per kilogram per minute, combined with the midazolam, may exceed what's clinically indicated for a patient with his current vital signs and respiratory status. He's stable. He doesn't need that level of sedation. The resident closest to Caldwell actually stepped backward. The second one pretended to look at her own notes. The third one watched Caldwell's face, which had gone very still. Are you finished? Caldwell asked. I'm asking about the protocol, Elena said. She kept her hands visible. Kept her voice level. This was the moment where things could escalate or dissolve. She had learned in Helmand Province that the way you stood determined whether people listened or closed ranks. Standard practice is to titrate sedation to the minimum required level. Oversedation increases complications, infection risk, and delirium outcomes. I'm aware of standard practice. Caldwell's voice dropped. The kind of dangerous quiet that came right before things broke. I'm also aware that I am the chief of surgery on this case and you are a nurse restocking supplies. Do you understand the difference? Yes, sir. Then I suggest you focus on tasks within your scope. He turned back to the computer. And never, ever question my orders in front of my residents again. Elena nodded. Said nothing more. She walked back to the crash cart and continued organizing supplies with the same methodical precision as before. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was regulated. The only sign of any stress was the way her right shoulder had tensed, the scar tissue tightening beneath the fabric of her scrubs. But that wasn't the worst part. At 12:07 a.m., as Elena was reviewing the general's full chart from his admitting history, she saw it. The emergency contact. The relationship listed on intake forms. In the section marked primary next of kin, Caldwell had circled a name in red pen and written a note beside it, Soldier KIA, Helmand Province, 2021. Confirm status with family. Elena's hand stopped moving. The chart felt very heavy in her hands. The ICU sounds, the beeping, the whooshing ventilators, the soft ping of monitors, seemed to fade away as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. She had known, academically, that General Marcus Hale had been in Helmand Province at the same time she was. She had known, in the way that military people always knew these things, that he had lost soldiers under his command. But seeing her son's name written in Dr. Caldwell's handwriting, seeing it circled and flagged like a data point in a medical file, like evidence of loss that meant nothing in a hospital 3 years later, that hit her differently. She folded the chart. Set it down on the counter. The dog tag beneath her scrub suddenly felt heavier than it had in months. She didn't touch it. Didn't pull it out. Didn't do anything that might show her hands were trembling, because the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Elena walked toward room for 47 to begin the night shift monitoring of a man she had sworn, 3 years ago, never to speak to again. A man whose hands had held her son. A man who had done his duty while she did hers, and the price of that duty was written in a metal rectangle hanging beneath her scrubs. The monitor in room for 47 beeped softly, steady and rhythmic. Elena pulled up the vital signs on the bedside screen, blood pressure dropping, 112/70. Heart rate slowing, now at 54. Oxygen saturation still holding, but the trends were moving in a direction that concerned her. The sedation protocol was working exactly as she had feared. She didn't call Caldwell back. She didn't challenge him again. She simply began the shift and watched the numbers on the screen, reading the patient like she had read hundreds of patients before, reading the way his body was responding to chemicals that he didn't need, reading the signals that no one else was listening for because they didn't know how to hear them. The night was long. The monitors hummed. And Elena Martinez, who had once been Major Elena Martinez of the Army Nurse Corps, kept watch over the man who held the last memory of her son, and said nothing at all. The overhead page crackled across the ICU at 6:44 a.m., cutting through the quiet hum of night shift winding down. Martinez. Supply closet. Now. Not Elena. Not Nurse Martinez. Martinez, the childhood nickname weaponized, broadcast across the entire floor so every nurse, every resident, every orderly heard her summoned like a subordinate being called to account. The 2 younger nurses at the station exchanged glances. One pretended to study her computer screen. The other suddenly became very focused on charting vitals that didn't exist yet. Elena set down the general's chart. Her hands didn't shake. She'd learned not to let her hands shake in Helmand Province, and 3 years of folding scrubs instead of body bags hadn't changed that reflex. She walked toward the supply closet with the same measured pace she'd used crossing a fire base under mortar fire. Dr. Caldwell was already inside, standing in the narrow space between shelves of saline bags and sterile gauze. The door swung shut behind her. The closet was small, 6 feet by 8, antiseptic smell thick enough to taste, fluorescent strip light casting everything in clinical white. He stood too close. Close enough that she caught the expensive cologne, something imported, the kind that cost more than her entire shift's wages. His jawline had the clean precision of someone who'd never questioned his own authority. "You've been here 18 months, he said, voice low enough that no one outside could hear. 18 months and you think you can question my protocols in front of residents? In front of a $500,000 research donation. General Hale wasn't just a patient. He was a funding stream. A grant waiting to be written. A reputation waiting to be burnished in some medical journal with Dr. Caldwell's name in 18-point font at the top of the byline. Elena took one measured breath. The air tasted like disinfectant and his cologne. The sedation dosage, she started, voice steady as surgical steel. "You're a floor nurse." Caldwell cut her off like a scalpel through silk. "Stay in your lane." The words hung between them. Not a request. A delineation. A wall. Elena's eyes didn't waver. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to show she wasn't afraid, not long enough to escalate. She'd learned the mathematics of defiance the hard way. Then she turned and walked out, the supply closet door swinging closed behind her. Patricia, the night charge nurse, was passing in the hallway. Her eyes dropped immediately. That was the real message. That was how the hospital would remember this moment, not as Elena raising a legitimate medical concern, but as Elena stepping out of line. Patricia had seen everything. Patricia would tell everyone nothing. That evening in the parking lot, the shift change crowd was filtering out like water through a sieve, the nurses heading home, night staff arriving, exhausted and quiet. The sun was dropping toward the tree line, painting everything gold and shadow. Caldwell found her by her car, a 2011 Toyota Camry with a cracked bumper and a check engine light that had been glowing since the Obama administration. He handed her a printed notice. Single-spaced. Official letterhead. Effective immediately. Overnight janitorial duties. "Perhaps mopping floors will teach you about hierarchy," Caldwell said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing he'd won. Knowing the system was built to protect him. Knowing that one nurse in a parking lot had exactly zero recourse. Several other nurses were close enough to witness the handoff. Elena watched their eyes skate away. The collective discomfort of people who knew what was happening and had already decided to survive by not seeing it. One of them, a younger RN named Sarah who'd been friendly during breaks, suddenly became very interested in her phone. A single tear escaped Elena's right eye. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. She reached up and wiped it without breaking eye contact with Caldwell, the motion as deliberate as checking a patient's pupils. "When you can't silence the truth," she said, voice pitched low so only he could hear, "you try to sweep it away. But I've always been better at cleaning up your mistakes than you've been at hiding them." The words came out with the precision of a surgical incision. Not angry. That would have given him satisfaction. Just factual. Just true. Caldwell's expression flickered. For one moment, she saw something cross his face, not fear, not quite, but the small disturbance of a man whose control had been questioned in front of witnesses. Then his face smoothed back into that practiced composure. "Careful, Martinez. One more word and you won't even have janitorial shifts." He turned and walked back toward the hospital entrance, his footsteps sharp against the asphalt. But Elena noticed, he didn't look back. Men who were truly confident didn't need to look back. The next night arrived like punishment. Elena showed up in janitorial scrubs, dark blue instead of the white and grey of nursing. The fabric was heavier. Coarser. It smelled like industrial detergent and resignation. The ICU nurses looked away as she emptied trash bins from the patient rooms, their eyes sliding past her like she'd become invisible. A young resident who'd been friendly in the cafeteria last week had smiled at her joke about the attending's hairpiece, now pretended not to see her, turning toward his computer screen when she entered with her supplies. The message was clear and perfectly executed. Caldwell hadn't just reassigned her. He'd systematically made her a ghost. At 11 p.m., Elena was mopping outside the ICU when she glimpsed General Hale through the window. Still heavily sedated. Monitors beeping in that steady rhythm that should have been reassuring but wasn't. His cardiac rhythm looked wrong from 50 feet away, the way the oscilloscope traced its pattern, too regular, too flat, like someone had turned down the volume on his entire cardiovascular system. Elena's medical training screamed warnings her janitorial badge didn't permit her to hear. She kept mopping. The water in her bucket turned gray. But that wasn't the worst part. She approached Patricia, the night charge nurse who'd avoided her all evening during the 11:15 p.m. medication pass. Room 447's cardiac rhythm, Elena started, voice soft, non-threatening, just one nurse to another. Patricia's expression shifted into something between sympathy and professional distance. Elena, you're not clinical staff anymore. I can't take reports from janitorial. The words were gentle. That was almost worse than anger. Anger would have meant Patricia disagreed. This was pity. This was someone following the rules that Caldwell had rewritten. Elena tried the on-call resident next, a second-year doctor named Chen who'd been cordial, who'd asked good questions during rounds. Chen's face went white when Elena pulled him aside. The general's care plan, Caldwell left explicit orders. Said nobody's to alter his protocols, and... Chen swallowed. And you're not supposed to be near him. At all. It wasn't a threat. It was information. Chen was a resident who valued his future more than his integrity, which made him a coward by the definition of anyone who'd ever worn a uniform, but a surviving coward by the definition of the medical hierarchy. By midnight, Elena understood the architecture of the trap. Caldwell had done this perfectly. He hadn't just demoted her. He'd strategically isolated her from anyone who might listen. Anyone who might act. She returned to the ICU break room where night shift was eating cheap pizza from the hospital cafeteria. The lead nurse, Marcus, was sitting with his feet up, scrolling through his phone. Elena tried once more, kept her voice level and professional. I'm seeing some concerning patterns in the general's sedation response and his cardiac output. Marcus cut her off mid-sentence. Caldwell pulled me aside this morning. Said you've been experiencing stress. Seeing problems that aren't there. He's concerned about you. The words landed like a slap. She was no longer a nurse raising a legitimate medical concern. She was a stressed-out woman seeing ghosts. Caldwell had preemptively discredited her. The strategy was flawless. Elena retreated to the supply closet where this had all begun, the small space where Caldwell had stood too close and explained her place in the universe. Now it was her sanctuary, which meant it had become her prison. She pulled out her phone. Who would she call? Her military contacts from the Army Medical Corps had moved on, deployments, promotions, career advancement that didn't include field hospital nurses. Her medical discharge had been 3 years ago. That version of her life existed in a different timeline. The dog tag felt heavy against her chest beneath her scrubs. Single dog tag on a broken chain. Her name on it. Her rank on it. The thing nobody here was allowed to know about. Through the supply closet door, she heard Caldwell's voice in the hallway. Even his tone was different after hours, more comfortable, like a man at home in his domain. I want Martinez's access to clinical floors restricted. Security badge reprogrammed. Not a request. An order. She was being erased. Not fired yet. That would have created documentation, potential legal exposure. But isolated, discredited, repositioned into irrelevance. The system was working exactly as designed. Her phone buzzed at 12:08 a.m. A scheduling app notification. The night shift supervisor had reassigned every nurse who'd witnessed her intervene in a coding situation last month, had seen her competence, her authority, her medical knowledge, to different floors. Effective immediately. All 3 of them. Not fired. Just scattered. Witnesses removed. Evidence dispersed. Caldwell was erasing witnesses. This wasn't stage 2 bullying anymore. This was stage 3. Strategic moves. Competent moves. The kind that came from someone who'd done this before. At 2:38 a.m., the ICU alarm screamed. The mop handle felt foreign in her hands, smooth, impersonal, nothing like the weight of surgical instruments or the grip of a crash cart. Elena pushed it across the ICU tile in long, mechanical strokes, her eyes tracking the monitors above each room as she passed. Room for 41, stable vitals, normal sinus rhythm. Room for 43, post-op cardiac, sedated, breathing over the ventilator. Room for 45, the traces looked wrong. Shallow rhythm variation. Something building beneath the surface. She knew better than to stop. Knew better than to look. But her body had been trained for 18 years to recognize the language of failing physiology, and that language didn't disappear because Dr. Caldwell had handed her a mop and a demotion. The night charge nurse, Patricia Morrison, sat at the central station reviewing labs. She'd worked with Elena for 5 years before the demotion, back when Elena could write orders, back when her assessments mattered. Now Patricia's eyes flicked away when Elena approached, the guilt of complicity written across her face. Room for 45. Elena's voice was low, careful. Not demanding. Never demanding. His central line placement looks shallow. The insertion depth. The attending cleared it. Patricia didn't look up from her screen. Dr. Caldwell personally reviewed everything this afternoon. I know, but the chest X-ray from 1800 hours shows. Elena. Patricia's voice dropped, glancing toward the hallway. I can't. You know I can't. Not anymore. Elena nodded once and moved the mop toward the next corridor. She understood the calculus. Patricia had a mortgage, 2 kids in college, and a department chair who would destroy anyone who appeared to validate Elena's clinical judgment. It was strategic. Brilliant, really. Caldwell had isolated her so thoroughly that helping her was professional suicide. The monitors kept talking anyway. Room for 45 was the general's room. At 2:15 a.m., she positioned herself near the supply alcove across from his door, pretending to restock the mop bucket. His pressures were drifting, nothing catastrophic yet, just a slow downward creep like a boat with a small leak. BP 118.72 at shift change. Now 114.68. The trend line was a falling angel. His central line. Caldwell had inserted it himself, which meant no second set of eyes, no resident to question the technique. Elena could see the dressing from where she stood, bulky, not quite symmetrical, the kind of asymmetry that meant the catheter tip might be resting against the vessel wall, creating inflammation. Days-old swelling could be seeding bacteria right now, invisible beneath the sterile gauze, a slow burn toward sepsis that wouldn't announce itself until the patient's body was already in revolt. She knew what sepsis looked like. She'd seen it in a field hospital in Sanjin Valley when a wounded Marine developed an infection from a contaminated blast wound. She'd watched the cascade, fever, tachycardia, then the blood pressure dropping like someone was draining him from the inside. By the time the commanding officer realized the severity, it had taken 3 units of blood and a helicopter transport just to keep him breathing. Elena turned back to her mopping. At 2:56 a.m., the monitors above room for 45 began their escalation. O2 sat was dropping, not plummeting, just a slow slide from 96 to 94 to 92. Heart rate climbing in compensation. The general's body was starting to work harder, compensation mechanisms kicking in, the alarm calls of a system under stress. She could hear Patricia's fingers on the keyboard at the central station. Could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing in their ballast casings, a sound like insects trapped in glass. Could hear the ventilators in the other rooms, their rhythmic whoosh and sigh like the breathing of sleeping giants. Then the monitor in room for 45 went flat. Not the slow descent of a patient in distress. The sharp, unmistakable spike of a body in crisis. The alarm started as a beep, then escalated into the full code blue scream, a sound designed to penetrate walls and summon help from 6 floors away. Code blue, room for 47. The overhead speaker crackled with static. Not 445. They'd gotten the room number wrong. Code blue, room for 47. All available personnel. Elena was moving before the announcement finished. The mop dropped. The bucket didn't matter anymore. She moved through the ICU with the muscle memory of 1,000 emergency responses, her body remembering what her mind wasn't allowed to do. The ICU doors were keycard access. Her demotion had deactivated her badge. She hit the emergency release button, the one used for rapid egress in actual emergencies, and nothing happened. The button was red, institutional, and completely unresponsive. She pressed again, the light staying dark. Through the window glass, she could see chaos beginning to organize. Patricia was pulling the crash cart from its bay. A night shift resident, someone Elena recognized as Dr. Patel, competent but not experienced with critical cases, was already at the general's bedside, checking pupils, checking for breath sounds. The general's color was wrong. Dusky. The kind of grey-blue that meant his lungs weren't exchanging oxygen. Elena pounded on the door once. No one heard. She pounded again, harder. Patricia glanced up, saw her, hesitated for exactly 1 second that felt like a year. Then she hit the emergency unlock from the inside. The door hissed open. Elena didn't ask permission. She moved into the room and the change was instantaneous, the way a soldier's posture shifts when the shooting starts, a physical transformation from civilian back into operational mode. Her voice, when she spoke, had dropped half an octave. What's his pressure? 60/40 and dropping. Dr. Patel was pale, already reaching for the phone. I'm calling Dr. Caldwell. His breath sounds. Left side absent. Right side diminished but present. Elena placed her hands on the general's chest, feeling through the thin hospital gown for the anatomical landmarks she'd memorized in another life. Her fingers found what her eyes could not see. The right side of his chest was hyperinflated, the compliance wrong, the resistance too high. His left side was silent because his lung wasn't inflating. The central line Caldwell had inserted was occluded or kinked, and the pressurized ventilator was forcing air into a closed system with nowhere to go. Tension pneumothorax. A lung collapsed, air trapped in the pleural space, the pressure building and pushing against his heart, crushing his venous return until blood couldn't flow back to the right atrium. His body was suffocating from the inside. 14-gauge needle. Now. Her voice was command register, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Prep the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Alcohol wipe. I need them in 10 seconds. Patricia moved without question. Dr. Patel stared, his hands frozen. We should wait for. We wait and he codes. Elena's eyes met his with the kind of calm that comes from having already seen the worst. We wait and he's dead. Get me the equipment. The resident moved. Elena's hands found the anatomical landmarks on the general's ribs, the second space between ribs, the midclavicular line where the needle would pass through muscle and fascia and pleural membrane to reach the trapped air. Her fingers had done this before in a canvas tent with mortar fire shaking the walls and a young soldier bleeding out next to a table where her son lay in a body bag waiting transport. She didn't think about that. She thought about pressure and anatomy and the fact that this man, this general who had held her son during his final hours, was going to die if her hands moved 1 millimeter wrong. The nurse handed her the needle. 14 gauge, long enough to penetrate the chest wall and reach the pleural space. Elena didn't check her work. Checking was for civilians. She found the space, angled the needle with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure in conditions far worse than a well-lit ICU, and pushed. The needle went in with the resistance of muscle, then the sudden give as it pierced the pleura. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. Elena had heard it in Helmand Province, in the tent, the sound of a collapsed lung re-expanding as pressure released. The sound of rescue. The general's oxygen saturation stopped dropping. Started climbing. 92, 95. 97, his color shifted from grey-blue back toward pink. His heart rate, elevated in compensation, began to normalize. The rhythm on the monitor steadied. 90 seconds. That's all it took. 90 seconds and a hand steady enough to thread a needle through a human chest in the dark. 90 seconds and Major Elena Martinez was fully, absolutely operational, and everyone in room for 47 knew exactly what they were looking at. Then the slow clapping started from the doorway. Dr. Caldwell stood there in press slacks and a golf shirt, his phone already at his ear, his smile genuine for the first time in Elena's presence. He'd been there the whole time. Watching. Waiting. Recording. Security. His voice was pleasant, unhurried. Yes, I need someone detained for practicing medicine without authority in the ICU. Room for 47. Send them immediately. And tell them to preserve all monitoring footage from the past 4 hours. This is evidence. Elena didn't move. The needle was still in the general's chest. The air was still hissing out of his lungs. The general's blood pressure was climbing back toward something resembling sustainable, and Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway with a phone and a smile and the absolute knowledge that he had exactly what he needed. Elena had just given him the evidence to fire her. The cardboard box hit the linoleum floor at 6:36 a.m., and nobody stopped to pick it up. Elena had dropped her mop handle the second the overhead page crackled through the ICU speakers, code blue, sepsis, central line infection, pressure dropping, and she'd moved toward the trauma bay with the muscle memory of someone who'd held 18 soldiers together across a canvas tent in Helmand Province. The janitorial badge around her neck caught on the ICU doors. Swipe. Nothing. Swipe again. The electronic lock stayed dead, and through the reinforced window she could see chaos blooming like a wound. General Marcus Hale's body convulsed against the mattress. The night shift resident stood frozen, lost, their hands hovering over equipment they didn't trust themselves to use. The attending, not Caldwell, thank God, some younger doctor named Patel who actually made eye contact, was already shouting orders, but the monitor showed what Elena could read from across the glass: oxygen saturation dropping, 68, 64, 61. The hiss of the ventilator wasn't keeping up. She could see it. The tension in his chest wall. The way his right lung had collapsed against the mediastinum, creating a valve that sucked air in with every breath but wouldn't let it back out. Tension pneumothorax. The day team had missed it. Caldwell had missed it. Elena pounded on the door. Open it. Now. Nobody heard her. A nurse was running for a crash cart. A resident was calling for a needle decompression kit, but his voice carried the tremor of someone reading from a textbook, not someone who'd actually done it. The general's oxygen sat at 58. His heart rate was 142 and climbing. His blood pressure had flatlined. She hit the door again. Harder. Her badge swipe, nothing. The electronic system recognized her as custodial staff. The ICU doors didn't open for people who pushed mops. The lock released. Elena didn't wait to see who had hit the button from inside. She was through the door moving, and the room rotated around her the way it used to in forward operating bases, time warped, sound compressed into individual components she could hear separately. The monitor beeping. Wheels squeaking. Someone's respirator hissing. The fluorescent overhead light suddenly audible like insects. 14-gauge angiocath, Elena said. Her voice came out flat and authoritative, nothing like the deferential murmur the night shift had been hearing for weeks. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Dr. Patel looked at her, then looked back at the general, then made the tactical decision that would either save a life or destroy it, do it. Elena's hands knew where to go. The anatomy lived in her muscle memory the way other people's hands knew how to tie their shoes. Index finger to find the rib. The needle at the angle that let air rush out, not into the thoracic cavity. She felt the pop as the needle pierced the parietal pleura, heard the thin whistling hiss of air escaping, the sound of pressure releasing, of death stepping back from the bed. Push another milligram epi, she said. The second resident moved without question. Get me a chest tube set up. 36 French. Now. Not a request. A command. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd done this before, someone who'd saved lives when the medical textbooks were useless because half the ceiling was shrapnel. General Hale's oxygen climbed. 64, 71. 82, The monitor showed a heart rhythm that wasn't sinus but wasn't flatline either, something the epinephrine had kicked back to life. His pupils dilated, reacted, focused. His hand moved. His fingers found her wrist. "Major," he whispered. She didn't acknowledge it. Her hands were already preparing the chest tube site, her movements economical and certain, her jaw set in the expression people got when they stopped being civilians and remembered what they actually were. A nurse who'd trained in operating theaters that doubled as mortuaries. A woman who'd sewn arteries together using equipment that would make a surgeon in a stateside hospital weep. The residents watched her work with the kind of awe usually reserved for surgeons who published papers. Dr. Patel watched her work with the kind of recognition that came from understanding you were watching someone operate at a level you weren't trained for. And then his eye shifted to the doorway. Dr. Caldwell stood framed in the ICU entrance, his phone already at his ear, his face arranged in an expression somewhere between fury and satisfaction. His finger was raised, the universal gesture of someone leaving a message, documenting evidence, building a file that would be locked in a cabinet until it was ready to be opened as a weapon. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Elena could read his intention the way she could read a monitor. He was already gone, already moved past this moment into the next one where he would use what he'd just seen as justification for what he was about to do. The general's blood pressure stabilized at 94/58. By 6:15 a.m., a hospital security guard had appeared at Elena's shoulder. Not aggressive. Just present. "Ms. Martinez, we need you to come with us." She didn't argue. That would have been hope, and Elena had learned to stop hoping around hour 7 of her first night shift in the janitorial department. She handed the chest tube site over to Dr. Patel with the kind of clinical transfer that didn't require words, and she walked out of the ICU between two guards whose job was just to make sure she went where she was supposed to go. The administrative conference room smelled like recycled air and the particular staleness of a space used for disciplinary meetings. Caldwell sat at the head of a polished table with a folder already open, pages printed and organized with the precision of someone who'd been preparing this moment since the second she'd questioned his sedation protocol. He looked rested. He looked vindicated. "Invasive procedure without physician authorization," he said, sliding the first page across the table like it was evidence at a crime scene. "Practicing medicine without a license. You have a janitorial job, Ms. Martinez. You have no clinical credentials in this hospital. When you performed that needle decompression, you violated state law." Elena's hands rested flat on the table. She'd learned this posture in basic officer training, hands visible, body language open, nothing that could be interpreted as threatening. The patient was going to die. He was in cardiac arrest. You created liability the moment you touched that needle. Caldwell slid another page. "We have surveillance footage. We have documentation from the attending physician. Dr. Patel has already submitted a statement that he was unaware of your credentials and made an error in judgment by allowing a non-physician to perform an invasive procedure." Elena's vision narrowed. Patel. The young doctor who'd met her eyes, who'd said do it. She could see exactly what had happened, a conversation behind closed doors, a suggestion that his future at Oak Creek Memorial was negotiable, a simple statement that if he wanted to keep his residency on track, he needed to revise the narrative. He'd do it. They all did eventually. "Sign the termination paperwork," Caldwell said. His voice had the texture of someone who'd already won. "Do this cleanly, and I don't file criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license." Elena picked up the termination papers. Her hands didn't shake. This was the muscle memory of a different kind now, the muscle memory of injustice, of watching institutions protect themselves instead of people. She'd seen it in Helmand, seen officers file reports that never saw daylight because the truth would have required accountability. "What about the patient?" Elena asked. "What about him?" His sepsis wasn't being managed by the day team. His oxygen saturation was declining. The tension pneumothorax wasn't in any of the charts. "If I hadn't? If you hadn't violated your scope of practice, we would have caught it during morning rounds." Caldwell's smile was a knife. General Hale's condition stabilized because he received appropriate medical attention from his physician team. Your involvement created a liability that we're managing by separating you from this hospital. He stood. She stood. They were the same height, but Caldwell occupied more space because he owned the building and she owned nothing but the cardboard box being carried out by a security guard who'd already put in his 2 weeks and didn't care anymore. Patricia was brought into a side room separately. Elena could see her through the frosted glass partition, her hand shaking as she answered questions. Caldwell had moved the night nurses to different shifts hours before Elena was escorted out. Patricia would start a new assignment in the ED, someone else would rotate to pediatrics, and nobody would have a coordinated story because Caldwell had made sure they couldn't coordinate anything. The young resident who'd frozen during the code received a commendation for managing a difficult situation. That's what the memo said when it was posted on the staff bulletin board at 6:24 a.m. Managing. Not freezing. Not watching. Managing. The language was soft enough to protect him, brutal enough to bury anyone who tried to contradict it. By 6:56 a.m., Elena's cardboard box was being handed to her in the hospital lobby as the day's shift arrived, and nobody made eye contact. The rumors had already started. She'd assaulted a patient, she'd gone rogue, she'd endangered someone's life by acting like she knew what she was doing. The story Caldwell had written was already spreading like spilled blood on a tile floor, already soaking into the fabric of the hospital's collective memory. The rain had started sometime during her termination meeting, and it fell on her jacket like judgment, like consequences, like everything she'd tried to escape by leaving the army catching up to her in a parking lot in Raleigh. Elena set the box down at the bus stop, rain soaking through her civilian clothes, and she let her spine collapse for the first time in weeks. The mug read, "World's okayest nurse." The succulent in the pot was dead. And the photo, her son's eyes, her son's smile, her son in dress uniform the day he shipped out to Helmand Province and came back in a flag-draped box, stared up at her from the bottom of the cardboard box. She pulled out the dog tag on the broken chain. The metal was cold. The inscription read like a name from someone else's life, Martinez, a Major, 04. Officer. Nurse. Someone who'd held people together when everything was falling apart. Someone who'd been good at her job in ways that mattered. Someone who'd been disappeared so thoroughly that she'd become a custodian instead of a caregiver, a name on a janitorial schedule instead of a medical record. The rain fell harder. A young mother with 2 children at the bus stop stared at Elena for a moment, read something in her posture that was familiar and tragic, then looked away the way people do when they recognize suffering they can't fix. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the only concession to breaking she would allow, and she straightened her spine out of pure habit, out of officer candidate school muscle memory, out of the bearing they drilled into her that didn't leave even when everything else had been taken. She sat on the bench with the cardboard box at her feet and the dog tag in her hand, and she didn't hear the sound at first, just registered it as weather, as traffic, as the ambient noise of a city waking up. But it grew louder. Deeper. A rhythmic percussion that made the rain seem to pause, that made the very air over the parking lot compress and expand like something was pushing down from the sky. Helicopter rotors. Elena looked up through the downpour as 3 black SUVs pulled into Oak Creek Memorial's emergency bay, their tires throwing spray across the asphalt, and a CH-53K King Stallion settled into hover position above the ambulance zone with the kind of authority that made security guards and administrative staff pour into the lobby windows to watch. The rotor wash died to a whisper as the helicopter settled onto the emergency bay landing pad, and through the rain-streaked glass of Oak Creek Memorial's lobby, Elena watched security guards scatter like startled birds. 3 black SUVs pulled to the curb in perfect formation, their doors opening to reveal figures in dress uniforms, the kind of uniforms that made hospital administrators straighten their spines without thinking. She stood motionless, still holding her cardboard box, the cracked mug pressing against her ribs, the photograph of her son's face hidden beneath the dying succulent like a secret she'd finally stopped protecting. A square-jawed colonel emerged from the second SUV, he's bearing the kind that came from 23 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and he walked directly through the lobby's automatic doors as if they'd been opened specifically for him. His eyes swept the crowd, nurses, orderlies, administrative staff, until they landed on Elena. Not on her badge. Not on her mop and bucket resting against the wall 3 feet away. His gaze went to her face, held there for exactly 1 second, then he spoke into the radio clip to his chest. Target located. Lobby, east entrance. He approached her with the kind of deliberate slowness that made the rain outside sound like applause against the windows. Major Martinez, he said. Not a question. A confirmation. Lionheart 6. Elena's jaw tightened, not from fear, but from the shock of hearing that call sign spoken aloud in a place that had spent 3 years trying to make her forget it existed. The cardboard box felt heavier suddenly, as if the weight of her discarded life had finally caught up with gravity. Around her, heads turned. Whispers started. She'd been the janitor an hour ago. Now she was someone important enough to warrant a special operations arrival in the middle of a rainstorm. I'm Colonel James Reeves, 160th SAW Night Stalkers, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The general's asking for you. He's in the ICU, upstairs, and he's not accepting visitors until he talks to you. Elena didn't move. Couldn't move. The box in her hands felt like it might shatter into 1,000 cardboard pieces if she breathed wrong. Behind the colonel, she could see hospital security exchanging confused glances with administration staff, and somewhere above them on the 4th floor, Dr. Caldwell was probably watching the monitors, watching the military arrival, watching his carefully constructed narrative collapse like wet tissue paper. She'd been fired 3 hours ago. Now there was a helicopter in the landing bay asking for her by her rank. Come with me, Colonel Reeves said, and she moved because soldiers move when they're given a direct order, even when they've tried for 3 years to stop being soldiers. The elevator ride upstairs felt like ascending into a previous life. The ICU doors opened to controlled chaos, medical staff scrambling to accommodate the uniforms suddenly flooding the unit, General Hale's room cordoned off, military presence radiating through the hallways like a pressure system. Elena stepped through the doors to his room and stopped. The general sat upright in his hospital bed, oxygen cannula in place, chest still monitored, but his eyes were clear, the eyes of a commander who'd made decisions that cost lives and lived with every one of them. A file lay open on the bedside table, her file, the one that should have been locked in classified storage in Arlington. Major Martinez, General Hale said, his voice rough from the ventilator but steady. Come here. She approached the bed like she was walking into the morgue, the place where they'd brought her son's remains 3 years ago for identification purposes. The general's hands trembled as he picked up the file, and she understood then that he'd been crying, not from pain, but from reading the things she'd spent a decade accumulating. The things that proved she'd been worth something before Dr. Caldwell decided she wasn't worth protecting. 18 combat saves, the general read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each line. Field medicine under active fire. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused, looking directly at her. The only nurse to perform a field thoracotomy in an active firefight using a combat knife. A knife, Major. Because the surgical equipment was compromised and your patient was bleeding out and you made a choice. His hands trembled visibly now. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 for shrapnel wounds sustained while tending to a casualty who wasn't even in your unit. The other 4. He stopped. Looked away from the file. Looked directly at her face instead. For being present when your son died. For performing medical aid on him after the IED strike while simultaneously treating 3 other wounded soldiers. For zipping him into a body bag and returning to the surgical tent to save the next one because that's what soldiers do when everyone depends on them. The room had gone so quiet that Elena could hear the cardiac monitor's steady beep, that reassuring electronic pulse that proved the general's heart was beating, that her emergency needle decompression had held, that her hands had been the right hands at exactly the right moment 3 hours ago. Colonel Reeves stood at attention near the door. 2 other Green Berets flanked the window. And somewhere in that silence, Elena felt the broken dog tag under her scrub shift against her collarbone like a weight being lifted. There's something else in here, the general continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. The night shift report. From the ICU nurse who checked my vitals at 2:45 a.m. Says my sedation levels were dangerously high, that my oxygen saturation was declining, that she documented her concerns but was overridden by the attending physician. Then the crash came 20 seconds after that documentation. Then you came. He set the file down carefully, as if it were made of something more fragile than paper. Your son died saving my life, Major. And then you spent 3 years not just rebuilding your own life, you spent 3 years saving everyone else's. You stayed quiet about it. You let them demote you to a janitor rather than make waves. But 3 years of quiet doesn't erase a decade of valor. General Hale gripped the bedside rails and leveraged himself upright, his bare legs swinging over the edge of the hospital bed, tubes and monitors protesting his movement with a chorus of alarms that no one moved to silence. He was unsteady, medical staff immediately stepping forward to support him, but he waved them back with the absolute authority of someone who'd commanded men in situations where the only choice was to stand or die. He found his balance, hospital gown gaping, the indignity of his position somehow making what came next more powerful instead of less. He dropped to one knee on the cold linoleum floor like he was being decorated on a parade ground, like there were 1,000 witnesses instead of the small group assembled in that ICU room. What I should have said 3 years ago, he began, and Elena could hear his voice breaking now, is thank you. Thank you for saving my life tonight. Thank you for serving your country with the kind of courage that most people will never understand. And I'm sorry, deeply sorry, that we failed you when you needed us most. We sent you home broken and told you to stop being who you were. But you never stopped, did you? You just learned to hide it. The colonel's hand was on Elena's shoulder, whether to steady her or to ensure she didn't flee, she couldn't tell. She was aware that her breathing had changed, that the cardboard box had somehow ended up on a nearby chair, that her son's photograph was visible now, resting on top of the cracked mug like a memorial. The general was still on one knee, still waiting for something she didn't know how to give him. So she stepped forward and did the only thing that made sense. She placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of release, of permission to stand, of acknowledgement that some burdens couldn't be shared. That was when the doors to the ICU opened and Dr. Caldwell stepped through, still wearing his white coat like armor, still carrying that portable tablet he used to document compliance and authority. His face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion, then understanding, then the realization that his carefully constructed narrative had been breached by military personnel and military protocol. He began moving toward the stairs, toward the elevators, toward anywhere that wasn't this room, watching a general drop to his knee in front of the woman he'd spent a night firing. Dr. Caldwell, a quiet voice called. It belonged to Thomas Chen, the IT director who'd been wearing his Marine Corps veteran cap in the basement server room for 6 years while no one paid attention. He stood with a hospital security officer, both of them blocking the stairwell exit. You'll want to see something. The conference room on the 3rd floor filled within 20 minutes, hospital CEO, board members, legal counsel, and Dr. Caldwell positioned at one end of a long table with the expression of a man who'd been invited to his own execution. The general, now back in his hospital bed and rolled down on a gurney accompanied by an oxygen setup, had declared that no further treatment would proceed until his questions were answered. He had that authority. It was written into decades of military protocol that once you held a general's rank, you held the kind of power that hospital administrators learned not to challenge. Thomas Chen stood near a large monitor, his fingers moving across a keyboard with the precision of someone who'd spent years in network security before his military service made him understand what mattered more than code. I'm going to start with security footage from the ICU at 2:15 a.m., he said quietly, clicking play. The screen showed Dr. Caldwell standing at a monitor, speaking with a night shift resident, his voice clear on the audio feed. Maintain the current sedation protocol. Stable enough. Reassess in the morning. The video timestamp showed the general's oxygen saturation declining in real time while the doctor deliberately chose to leave him unmonitored. That's not evidence of anything, Dr. Caldwell began, but the CEO had gone pale, and the board's chief legal officer was already opening her notes. There's more, Thomas continued, unmoved. Supply closet camera, approximately 7:06 p.m. yesterday. The video showed Dr. Caldwell cornering Elena, showing her a printed demotion notice, his words audible, "One more challenge to my orders and you're gone." The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in on everyone except the Marines in dress uniform standing at attention along the perimeter. "He asked me to delete the files this morning," Thomas said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd made a choice that would define his career. "I didn't. Instead, I contacted the state medical board. These are phone records showing Dr. Caldwell pressured 7 staff members to falsify reports about tonight's emergency, reassigned every witness to different shifts, and altered the original sedation orders in the digital chart at 7:16 a.m., for hours after Major Martinez's intervention." He slid a folder across the table. Inside it were medical records, timestamps, digital signatures on falsified documentation. Everything Caldwell had thought was buried was now open like a surgical wound. The general straightened in his bed. "You endangered my life to protect your reputation. Then you destroyed the career of the woman who saved me. You're done, Dr. Caldwell." The hospital's legal counsel didn't need to say anything. 2 security officers appeared, and Dr. Caldwell's professional life ended in the time it took to walk from the conference room to the elevator. He tried once to make eye contact with Elena, a final play, a last attempt to communicate something, anything that might salvage his position. She met his gaze with the steady regard of someone who'd learned long ago that shame requires an audience, and she had no intention of being that audience anymore. 6 months passed like a held breath finally released. Elena sat at her new desk in the Chief of Emergency Medicine's office at Oak Creek Memorial, overlooking the trauma bay where she'd once mopped floors while wearing a rank that no one was allowed to know about. The nameplate read, "Major, Ret, Elena Martinez, Chief of Emergency Medicine." On her uniform hung the Bronze Star. Her discharge papers, which had permitted her to separate from active duty with her rank retired and preserved, now hung framed on the wall beside her medical certifications. The dying succulent from her cardboard box thrived now in the sunlight streaming through the office window. The cracked mug held pens. And in a frame beside it sat 2 photographs, one of her son in his dress uniform, and one of Elena kneeling at his grave at Arlington, finally able to honor him openly, finally permitted to acknowledge the rank and the service that had shaped every choice she'd made. The dog tag was no longer hidden. It hung openly from a new silver chain, visible when she wore her uniform, a constant reminder that some secrets are worth keeping until the moment comes to finally tell the truth. Patricia knocked and entered with a tablet. The Veteran Transition Program is bringing in 12 former combat medics next month. Your new trauma protocols reduced ED complications by 34%. And the State Medical Board concluded their investigation. Elena nodded, knowing what came next. Dr. Caldwell's medical license was revoked. His professional reputation was shattered. And somewhere in a strip mall parking lot across the street, he sat at a folding table selling supplemental insurance to people who walked past without stopping. Thomas Chen appeared in the doorway late that afternoon, and Elena stood to shake his hand. "Thank you for what you did," she said. "For preserving the truth. For not deleting the evidence." Thomas shrugged with the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing you'd made the right choice. Marines don't leave Marines behind. Even when they're Army. A smile crossed his face, and Elena recognized the particular warmth of someone who understood what it meant to carry a uniform in your heart long after you stopped wearing it. That evening, Elena visited General Hale at the VA hospital where his cardiac recovery was progressing. He walked unassisted now, his color returning, his strength rebuilding itself like a house being restored room by room. They sat in the garden where other veterans gathered, some in wheelchairs, some with visible scars, others with invisible ones that lived beneath the skin. "How's the new position?" he asked. "Busy. Important. Strange to wear my rank again, even just in the office." Elena touched the dog tag at her throat, a gesture that had become unconscious now, no longer nervous, just natural. "My son would have liked knowing I stopped hiding." General Hale looked out across the garden, watching the other veterans move through their recoveries. "David was the best soldier I commanded. And you're the best officer I've served with. The Army failed you both, but you never failed your oath. Walking through the hospital corridor on her way out, Elena was approached by a young nurse, new, nervous, wearing a fresh hospital badge with the ink barely dry on the laminate. "I'm starting in the ED next week. I heard you deployed." "I just got out of the Navy." The girl's hands trembled slightly, the way Elena's had once trembled before she learned to make fear become focus. Elena saw herself reflected in this young woman's uncertainty, in her search for permission to be both who she'd been and who she was becoming. "What's your rate?" Elena asked. "Hospital corpsman. I'm scared I won't be good enough here." The words tumbled out like a confession, like shame, like the weight that Elena had carried alone for so long. Elena placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "You've already proven you're good enough. Now you just have to remember it when someone tries to make you forget." She wrote something on a card and handed it over. "My direct line. You call if anyone makes you feel like your service doesn't matter." Leaving Oak Creek Memorial that afternoon, Elena passed the bus stop where she'd broken down in the rain 6 months earlier, clutching a cardboard box and believing her service had ended in disgrace. A woman with 2 children waited there now, and Elena remembered being invisible, being disposable, being told that hiding who she was the price of survival. She got in her car and saw the quote she'd written on her dashboard, the word she'd repeat at next week's veteran graduation ceremony where 18 new veteran medical staff would receive their white coats. "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." She drove back to Oak Creek Memorial, where Dr. Caldwell would never work again, where her protocols now saved lives, where the truth had finally been spoken aloud in the place where she'd learned to hide it. And she thought about all the quiet people in hospitals across the country who carried military service in their hands like a secret, and she made a decision that would reshape her career forever. Starting next month, Oak Creek Memorial would launch the first formal veteran transition program for combat medics and military nurses entering civilian healthcare. No more people like her. No more hiding. No more cardboard boxes in the rain. If you're ready to subscribe for stories about the quiet ones who change everything, the ones who carry strength in places no one's looking, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens when hidden heroes finally stand in a light. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were Elena and the moment came to choose between staying invisible or finally being seen?